You're listening to If These Woods Could Talk, produced by the Rhinelander District Library. More information can be found at rhinelanderlibrary.org. Now follow If These Woods Could Talk on Facebook and Instagram for new episodes, other history blurbs, and civil discussion. Subscribe to These Woods on your podcast platform of choice to get new episodes as they're released. If these woods could talk, they might tell you that there is no illegal moonshine operation here and to beat it and stop asking questions if you know what's good for you. We had the chance to talk with Grant Voermans, an author and historian from Harrison who has been digging into the history of Harrison since high school. Grant recently released his self-published work, The Harrison History, 130 Years of Logging, Farming, and Bootlegging. It's filled with decades of research, stories, and some really excellent old photographs from the area. We talked about his family history, his own journey to publishing this book, and some of the stories in the Harrison history.
If these words could talk, would you sit and listen to tales of those who came before us in the virgin pines with the river glistening? Sit on back with friendlies, share some stories about butterflies, days gone by on the sunset hill of glory.
So my name is Grant Voermans, and I recently wrote, self-published a book on the history of Harrison. So I was invited here to talk a little bit about the book and hopefully some stories about the Harrison history. Basically, Harrison was is a little unique in its history and its beginnings, but also quite common for the Northwoods of Wisconsin, where the beginnings basically are owed to lumber companies. There was the U.S. was building at a pretty strong pace, so they needed lumber. So Wisconsin had a lot of logs. So as immigrants moved to Wisconsin, lumber companies moved in as well, and as development moved further north, all these little towns popped up. And basically, the beginnings just started by a logging company buying a lot of land in the area and building a sawmill and inviting immigrants to come in to work for them. So that's how Harrison started. There was a company from Wausau that built a sawmill at a lake. In Harrison, there was absolutely nothing there. And pretty soon the railroad tracks followed. And then this town sprung up around this lake, this sawmill. So then basically what happened from there is all the logs were cut out and the lumber company moved further north. And then there was still some immigrants that held tight in the area. There was a little bit more smaller logging operations that went on. And then Harrison's unique because there was a priest in Tomahawk that had Belgian origins, and so he was trying to get immigrants from Belgium and the Netherlands to come over and settle this area of Harrison, because what he was trying to do is create a Catholic community there, basically. So he was successful, and he persuaded a whole bunch of Dutch and Belgian immigrants to settle in the area. So it's a hub of all these Dutch and Belgian, descendants, basically. So then from there's some interesting stories with these immigrants farming, but then also there's some pretty unique prohibition stories too in the Harrison area, just because there was a very big distillery that was set up in a farm, and it was raided by the feds, and at that time it made really national headlines in the whole U.S. So it has a pretty unique history. There were a lot of farms there for a lot of years. There was a cheese factory that was supported by all the farms. So It's a very beautiful area. It's got a unique landscape with a lot of hills, rolling hills, and a lot of little lakes. There's, I think, around 125 little pothole lakes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very high recreational area, and it has a pretty big population just because of all those little lakes and the cottages that exist there. So that's pretty much Harrison.
Just about a month ago, got to go to a Catholic wedding that was in Harrison. What a beautiful little church they got right there
It
across
is.
from Town Hall. Great place.
That's correct, and that was really kind of the hub in 1906. The first church, not that church, there was one before it, was built right there. Little different orientation, but that was the hub of the Catholic community right there at that church.
Well, let's jump forward from 1906 a little bit here, and let's start with the Grant Voermans story.
So my great-grandfather, he was an immigrant from the Netherlands. His name was Janus. And then when he moved to the U.S., he was called John because the immigrants tried to really Americanize themselves, partly because they couldn't speak English well. So when they showed up in the U.S., instead of the authorities at Ellis Island, they couldn't always understand, so they did their best to try to interpret what the names were. But also, these immigrants really wanted to fit into the U.S., so they wanted their names to be more American and not from the old country. So he came to the U.S. with his two brothers. His older brother was first, and then his younger brother came after him. But he immigrated to the U.S. in 1911. And then he met another Dutch immigrant there and married her in 1913. And so then basically that's kind of where my family roots started. So then my grandfather grew up in that same farm where they started, and we still own those families' farms. I was born and raised not in one of those farms, but right down the road. And now I do live in one of those family farms. So it's my roots go way back to my great-grandfather, and actually, interesting enough, I've made the connections to relatives back in the Netherlands, and I've been over there a couple times and talked to them, and we've shared kind of those stories, because there was one brother that stayed over there, so I have a lot of relatives over there yet, and it's kind of neat to bridge that gap.
It is so interesting. So just the capability to do that. Did you do the ancestry kind of thing? Yeah,
I did. And it's interesting because some of these other families, there was another family that made a trip over there before me, and I didn't really realize I had family over there. I suspected it, and I know some of, like my grandpa said, oh yeah, we had family, but I had no idea where they were, who they were. But we had some neighbors, they had taken a trip over there, and they kind of by accident ran into somebody that was doing a historical book on that side. So that person quickly contacted them, and that family knew that I was kind of the local historian, so that gentleman from the Netherlands got a hold of me, and he knew my family over there, so then we made that connection, and that was probably about 6 years ago.
That's wild.
Yeah, so it's really interesting and a lot of fun.
So, you mentioned Giannis becoming John.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know anything about was their surname Voermans as well?
Yes, it was the last name they kept the same.
They kept that the same. All
They
right.
did, yes.
So then you were born. What's your house look like? Siblings, pets, mom and dad?
Yeah, so I was born, I had 3 brothers, one older, 2 younger. My dad worked at the paper mill in Tomahawk, but he also did some cash crop farming with the family farm. So we tried to keep that up, help pay for taxes and maintain the fields and keep it looking nice.
All that property is pretty much connected, right in the
It
same,
is.
right on the row. Yeah.
It is. It's all connected. So one of the family farms, actually my great-grandfather's brother, they ended up selling it, but my brother and I bought it, so we kept it in the family. So it's still all family land right there, connected. The two farms are right across from each other.
Well, let's talk school. Elementary school.
Yeah, so I attended Tomahawk Elementary School. Actually, I attended St. Mary's private school in Tomahawk. It was the Catholic school up to 6th grade. And then I went over to the Tomahawk. It would have been middle school or junior high, I guess, at that time. And then attended Tomahawk High School.
Okay.
And there from there, I went on to do some secondary education. I went to UW-Platteville and got my mechanical engineering degree.
So you have a favorite teacher, someone you shout out here?
Yeah, actually, so kind of related to this book, I had a high school literature teacher. Her name was Mrs. Stiff. And one of the projects, I think it was the last project of the school year, was to do a research paper. And my mom suggested, well, why don't you do it on the history of Harrison? So I thought, well, that's a great idea. I love talking to my grandfather on the old stories, and I just loved history. So so I thought, well, that's a great idea, and I started researching some more, and I just found a lot of great information on the history. So that was the start of this whole book, was in Mrs. Stiff's class, this research paper. So I ended up finishing that, but I never stopped the research. It went, actually, I still research as much as I can on the history of Harrison and some of the neighboring areas. So I wouldn't call her my favorite teacher, but she was a very good teacher, and I really owe, the credit for starting all this book to, her project of the research paper.
That darn essay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, that's awesome. So you had prior to that, though, a love of history and local history at that.
I did. Yeah, there was someone else in the area that wrote kind of a light history. It was more around the church, the history of that church. And when I read that, I was just fascinated by how the history went back and how the church was first built. So that really captured, my love for the area history, because I knew it was unique and interesting. So, and my grandfather, I would constantly ask him about stories, and he was, he lived there all his life. So I'd ask him about stories, and he loved to tell me stories about the history. So that really set me on a path to really want to dig into more history of the local area.
I read that there was an earlier edition of this book.
Correct.
So when was that, and do you consider this a separate book or an update, a second edition?
So basically, like I talked about the research paper, from there I just kept researching and digging up, collecting pictures and more stories, and there were a lot of people that suggested that I should write a book. So then after I got out of high school and into college, I started continuing the research and putting a book together. So when I was, it would have been, I believe in 98, I published the first version. I just had a lot of information, and I put it all together, and I printed that book, and I think I printed about 800 copies, and everyone really liked it. And I never really stopped researching, just because I found out more information. I found more newspaper articles. I found more pictures. So I just kept collecting, and just mostly because I was interested. I never really thought I'd do another version.
Mm-hmm.
But then, starting probably 6-7 years ago, more and more people were asking for that book, and I never printed anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I just don't have any more. I never plan to print anymore. So more people asking, and so finally I thought, well, I don't really want to print the original version because I have so much more information.
Mm-hmm.
So then I took the first version and I just kind of expanded on it. I tried to keep a lot of the same essence of the first one just because a lot of people liked it. So I kept a lot of the story and the information, but built on it. And then changed some things, added some things, but mostly kept it the same. And I added a whole lot more pictures. And of course, now the printing, the technology, everything is so much better than it was available even in 98. 98 to me doesn't seem that long ago, but the technology really wasn't that good with scanning pictures and printing, and also at that time I was on a college shoestring budget, so that was a little tougher too. But so basically this most recent book is a second edition, and it's really an expansion of the first edition. Mm-hmm. Pretty much everything is in there. I think there's 2 pictures that I didn't include just because they were difficult and I had kind of better versions. So I didn't include them in the second edition, but everything is pretty much there from the first edition.
Okay.
I kept asking questions, and part of it, like the early history, was really challenging. To me, it still is because there's a little bit of mystery there because there was like a gap when the lumber company moved north to when a lot of the immigrants, my family, and all the relatives came over. There was a gap, so there's not a lot of information on what happened there. So the only thing that I can pull out is from old newspaper articles. I did a lot of research in Merrill, so figuring out some of that early history is kind of a mystery.
When you talk about Merrill looking at newspapers, are we talking about microfilm?
Microfilm, exactly. So if you're probably familiar with those. You put the roll in there and you scroll through, and if you don't really know what you're looking for, if it's not digitized, you're looking manually. If it's digitized, then you can do word searches and
Control
whatnot.
F, yep.
But with the rolls, you're just kind of rolling through, and if you have like some sort of dates or years, at least it helps narrow it down a little bit. But it's time consuming, very time consuming. I think one of the really helpful things were some of the older people in the area. For one, families' pictures. They're the ones that could provide most of the pictures. And then a lot of the information, they had really good information about just everyday life. But when it came to like facts and figures, usually it was digging into the newspapers to, try to get some of those articles. But like I say, it's very difficult to find a lot of that stuff just by flipping through.
So a question just from doing my own research into 120 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had luck finding primary documents, journals, that sort of thing? Is there anything like that?
Not really journals, but there was somebody that did some research on like post offices in Lincoln County a long time ago. I think probably in the 40s maybe. And he was able to find, like, for example, a letter that was written back in, I think it was 1892 in Old Harrison. Someone had sent it from Harrison to, I don't know where it had gone, but anyway, it was really interesting because it provided like a little snapshot of life there in Harrison. So I was lucky enough to find that, and I was tickled when I did find it.
I bet.
So things like that, it's really hard to find, but sometimes they just show up. Like when you don't expect some of these pictures, like I still expect in my lifetime that some of these things will show up just, by happenstance, or, someone finds out about them, and then if, what happens is I'm kind of the known historian, so they contact me and like, oh, you want to see this picture? You want this, you interested in this information? I'm like, yes, I am.
Okay. So how much are you door-to-door soliciting information versus people just come to you?
Well, it's probably more now people coming to me, but when I first got it started, I would do a lot of door to door, and I knew a lot of the families in the area, so it wasn't technically door to door, but it was still sitting down with some of these individuals and talking about their family and what they knew, and so I mean that information, if it's not captured, it's lost. When those older generations, they pass away.
Yep. History lost every day.
Yeah, exactly.
Any rejection at the door?
Oh no,
No.
everybody was always really willing to talk.
That's awesome.
Even borrow pictures. There were some of those pictures that I'm like, if this was my picture, I don't know that I'd borrow it, but I always, I just make a copy and I'd give it back.
Oh yeah.
But everyone was very good about borrowing that information.
And you do have a ton of really great pictures in here.
Yeah, there was some that, like I said, I can't believe that I stumbled upon, but I did.
And are they primarily from just individuals, private people around? Is there?
It's a mix.
Yeah.
I actually have found some recently on Ancestry. I've done a lot of research on Ancestry too, and there were pictures that showed up there that people posted. I don't know who posted them, but I found pictures and I knew what they were, and then I tried to get hold of the individual that had posted them to try to see what else they had or what they knew of the history, and so it's really a variety. They just came from all different directions. My great grandmother had some really, really good ones. Some others in the family had some really, really good pictures. So,
Guess they've been around.
yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else in your family before you do genealogical? That obviously used to be a lot more difficult than it is today. But is there that background in your family of research, or?
Not really.
Yeah.
No one ever really did it. Like I said, even going back to in the Netherlands, my grandfather knew there was family over there, but he never really knew like who was over there, and there was just kind of a lost touch after his dad, the one that immigrated from the Netherlands, passed away. There was no longer any writing back and forth. It was just kind of lost at that point. So no one really ever did any genealogy. So, and yeah, like you say, it was difficult. It was so much more difficult back even, 30 years ago. And then almost impossible when you got back, 50, 60 years ago.
Unless there's a family tradition of documenting
Yes.
along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything you'd like to just say about the book?
Well, I think, it's an interest. I try to keep some general information. Like, for example, one of the chapters is on logging camps. And I thought that was really interesting, too, because logging here in Wisconsin, not much different than a lot of the Midwest and some out east. It was really unique the way it was done, just because there were camps out in the middle of nowhere, and these men would live in these camps for months on end and just work from, sun up to sundown. It was just kind of brutal work. So it's almost kind of a unique culture that was in these camps. And it was an era that was very unique in our history. So I tried to capture a lot of that with some of the detail of how these camps worked, and who worked in them, and what they did and how they did it. And so it's not only just the local Harrison history, it's some of that just general, history from our past that can relate to a lot of different areas. So, and there's just a lot of great general pictures in there too that are kind of neat from the overall history. So And I would say the book turned out really well. I tried to make sure it was a good quality printing, and I'm very proud of how it turned out. So I even did color. Always when you're printing books, color is a lot more expensive, and very few of the pictures are color, but I wanted to capture some of that like yellowing that makes the pictures just feel a little bit more old. So I tried to do that. And I really like how it turned out. So I'm quite proud of it.
On the subject of the lumberjack camps, great information in that chapter. In depth shows you, what life was like. Some fun lumberjack slang in there as well.
Yes.
Of course, I can't remember. Okay, take a look.
Yeah, I don't remember. Like for example, there was lice that just because of close quarters and people didn't clean themselves often enough, and they called them pants rabbits and
Seam squirrels,
yeah. So kind of comical.
That made me laugh. Yeah.
And like they'd all hang their socks up because their boots weren't the best, so everybody's socks would get wet from all day in the woods, and they'd hang their socks up, and I couldn't even imagine the smell that was lingering in there with the camp stove trying to keep the place warm. And then in the morning, everyone would quick scurry out and grab the best socks. Whatever socks they felt were the best. It didn't matter if they were theirs or not. They were going to grab the socks. And if you didn't get your butt out of bed and grab your own socks, it's too bad. You lose them.
Cold feet.
Yeah.
I imagine that we're drying these nasty socks about 10 feet away from where we're making the chili.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, exactly.
Do you want to share a few stories from...
Well, I think one of the most interesting that everybody talks about in the book is the distillery that was, we refer to it as the keg farm now, but it's kind of interesting, and I'm really interested in that piece. I own the property now that it was on, so I got a very keen interest in that whole, basically everything around what happened there. And I've done a lot more research, so there might be another book that comes out specifically on that, just because there's a lot to it on how it happened and what happened that I didn't include in here, because I'm kind of saving it for another sort of focus book. So just as kind of a spoiler, there's likely going to be another one. But it's interesting because there's no documented connections to Al Capone, but a lot of this alcohol, I think, was connected to, his group. A lot of it went down there, but also went to some other areas too, like Minneapolis and Milwaukee, so it wasn't just Chicago. But it was interesting that all this equipment they stuck in this little barn, relatively little barn, out in the middle of nowhere, which is why they did this. Mm-hmm. And there was basically 3 long driveways that came in, so you could, if one was blocked or if the authorities came in on one, they could leave on another. But basically, I would love to find a picture. I haven't been able to find a picture, but I can just imagine all this big equipment, vats and the stills and the silos inside of this barn, and all just making, I think it was about a 55-gallon drum of pure alcohol every day. So they make this alcohol, and then they put it in a truck and ship it down to Chicago, Milwaukee, wherever it was. And it only went on for, I think it was probably about 4 or 5 months. And then somehow, some way, the authorities got word, so they got in the county. I think the state had several, and even the federal had a few agents that came in to make the bust, and then they basically destroyed it or dismantled everything in there and then sold it on auction. But
Okay.
it was a big deal. The headlines, the Rhinelander newspaper, and Tomahawk newspaper, they claimed that it was the largest raid in the state at that time, largest distillery.
Yes, they call it Mammoth.
Mammoth, yes.
Now, did you do the math here? $100,000 alcohol plant? What's that look like today? That's a lot of money.
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I imagine it was somewhere close to $1 million.
I would have to think.
I would expect, because that was 1927, so that was during the Depression too.
Sure. Right at the start.
So, and there was a lot of locals involved, that whole thing, and I remember my great uncle saying that it was the best thing that could happen to that town because it brought in so much cash. People worked there and they were paid in cash.
At the still?
At the still, yeah.
Paid in cash, okay.
People had to build it. People had to work there. People had to haul all the materials. So they didn't ship anything local. They shipped a lot here to Rhinelander because it was a bigger town. If you get a carload of corn mash shipped to a little town like that, someone would be like, why?
What are we going to...
Yeah, what's going on here? It would have been just a quick, it just never would have worked. So it was shipped to Rhinelander here by train, and then someone would take the horses in a wagon. Actually, my great-grandfather, step-great-grandfather, was one that hauled. He'd haul at night. He'd come up here with the horses in the wagon and get that car loaded in a wagon and head back down there and unload it in the morning. So there was a lot of locals involved in it, and it brought a lot of good cash to those farmers that were struggling during the Depression.
Open secret. Good for them.
Yeah. I think one thing I've found is there's all kinds of bootlegging stories. Bootlegging happened all over the place. So it seemed like every family had their story of they made their little bits of, alcohol in some way or another, and it actually was a pretty good source of income for some people because they'd make it and they'd sell it. Even my great-grandmother said she would bring some to someone up here in Rhinelander she'd sell it to. She'd make it in a crock at home and sell it to someone up in Rhinelander.
If all you needed was the knowledge and a good hiding spot, which farmers had.
Exactly.
Lots of land, lots of woods.
Yep.
Bales of hay.
Yep.
Creeks. It all
Exactly.
played a big role.
And so she would take it would have been my great uncle. She'd take him in the car because he was little at the time. He was probably 5 years old. And if he was in the car, then it didn't look so suspicious that she was making some sort of delivery.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to imagine what they were thinking with the Prohibition, and obviously not all that effective.
Yeah.
But when you look at stories particularly, I'm more acquainted with the Rhinelander stories, but there's all this talk of the tunnels that are here and there and under the streets, and this is where there was a tunnel. Presumably that's where we did the bootlegging and just hit it from... You hear anything like that in Harrison? Are we underground?
Well, no, I've never heard of anything underground, but there has been some stories that surfaced more around, like the Tillman family was a family that had a lot of, they did bootleg themselves, and they actually sold it to Al Capone and his men, and then there was a point in time where slot machines were illegal, and so there was one point where they had a bunch of those in their barn, and when probably the county cops were coming in, at some point they had hauled them all out somewhere, and there's been stories that a hunter ran into a cave somewhere out there and had all these old slot machines in there. So it hasn't been confirmed, hasn't been found, but there has been people that have said it's out there.
So hunters and spelunkers in the area get to work. That's
Yeah.
intriguing.
Exactly.
I know
So,
Clover Club was actually owned by Dave Tillman.
yes.
And he had a secret room downstairs where he did have slot machines even after.
Oh,
you know,
really?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of those.
Mm-hmm.
That illegal stuff lived in their family.
Yes, it did.
Is anybody going to be mad about about the mention of the name? Probably. Okay.
I don't think so.
It's in, yeah.
Yeah, it's in there, and I know there's just a lot of stories from Elsie Tillman about, she was involved in that bar, so she knew a lot of people, and she was involved in the bootlegging business, and she has a lot of stories out there that were written about her in newspapers and a lot of different authors.
So to change the subject slightly, very slightly, you've got a chapter about taverns in the area.
Yes.
So I guess I'm interested in what you know of the early taverns, but also how the Prohibition played a part in if you're a tavern owner.
Well, that's a pretty good question, and I think the best example, the most information I found is actually on the Tillman's Tavern. So initially in Harrison, during the early logging days, the owners of the sawmill, the lumber company, didn't want any alcohol in the town. So there was never any tavern there during the early years, but there was somebody outside of town that built a log cabin and served any kind of alcohol. So it was within reach. It was just a little further to walk to for all the residents. But then later, there was a tavern built, and during Prohibition, they were very creative. So they had dances, and then also they called it a ice cream parlor or a soda parlor, where that was the front, but if you really wanted some alcohol, you went in there and you got your alcohol, under the table, but it was there and available. And then there's some stories in there, even in that tavern, when they'd have dances, there were a lot of people, so it was an old building. It was pretty, creaky, noisy. They'd be basically doing all their activities of bottling and doing some of the rolling of the barrels up above while that was going on, just because then there was some cover. Yeah. So there was a lot of fronts to getting around Prohibition. It actually didn't seem like it was that difficult to get alcohol if you wanted it at all.
Got another story for me? How about a grandpa story?
A grandpa story. Well, okay. So my grandfather, so the still was around in 1927, and he would have been 14 years old at that time. So old enough to kind of know what was going on and be a part of it, curious. So he lived kind of as a crow flies, probably about a half a mile away from this distillery that was raided, being built. And so one day he was walking over there, or walking back, one of the two, but he stumbled across this gunny sack full of tin cans. And these tin cans were full of moonshine. So he hauled it back to the farm. And so he hid it also, because he had a stepfather, and I don't think his stepfather really liked him a whole lot. So he hid it mostly because his stepfather, he knew his stepfather would want to drink it or take it or do whatever. So he hid it up in the silo. You climb up, normally there's like I don't know what you call it, but a ladder up there, but it's all enclosed. That's how you tossed all the silage down, that chute, basically. So he went all the way up in the top, and he strung it up there and hid it up there. And his stepdad knew he had it, but he wanted to know where it was, and he would never tell him. So one day his little brother and him were playing hide and seek, and he shimmied up that ladder and he hit his head on those tin cans. So, but anyway, what happened with all that alcohol is he'd have his friends over. My grandpa would have his friends over, and they'd all just get drunk on the moonshine. Yeah. And that's really how his stepdad knew he had it, because there was always his drunk friends
Too much
around the farm, yeah. So,
yeah.
But that was kind of an interesting story.
Let's talk about where you can get the book.
Sure. So, Nutsy's in Harrison, very good place. Kevin and Bonnie got a great business there. I love that restaurant, and they sell it, so you can get copies there. I do have an online store, so if you go to theharrisonhistory.com, you can get it there. And actually, another note too, there was still so much interest in that first edition book. People were still asking for it, which I thought this would satisfy people just because it pretty much has everything, but people kept asking about that first edition. So finally I just printed some more. So you can get the first edition on my website as well. And I have limited copies. I ran out of the printing, but then I'm done. So if anybody wants some of those early copies, you can get one, and it's identical to the first. So it's got, so even the same printer did it. So you can get it at the website, you can get it at Nutsy's, or I do have some at the Tomahawk Library also. If people want to stop there, they can pick up a copy.
Plus, you can swing by the Rhinelander Library and check out our new copy.
Absolutely, that's right.
And thank you for that.
You bet. I think, for me, this is something that I wanted to do because I'm interested, but I really also wanted to do it to preserve history. Just because I struggled so much trying to find these bits and pieces and put them together. And like I said, there's still some bits that I can't quite put together, and I'd like more information on and more pictures. And so I'm always in search. But now that I have this printed, to me it's kind of preserved for forever. So that was important for me, for my family, for my kids. That I had this so that they can always look back and see where their family came from. And so I know that a lot of families, it's the same way. I wanted to make sure that they had those roots to be able to share as they went forward. So that was really the big driver for me, the motivation, beyond my interest in the history. So I think that's a pretty good conclusion.
Yeah, well, Grant, thanks for coming.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of If These Woods Could Talk, produced by the Rhinelander District Library. A special thanks to the Old Pine Road Band for the musical theme. To learn how you can record your own story of the Northwoods, or to suggest a topic or storyteller, contact the library or check out the website at rhinelanderlibrary.org.